The prison system is an integral cog in the complex ecosystem of a country. 14 prisons exist in Ireland today. It costs, on average, more than €100 million to run each of those prisons annually. More prisons are being built to accommodate the steady growth of incarcerated prisoners in our little island. In 2007, a total of 9,711 people were locked up in prison during this year. In 2012, this number steadily increased to 13,860, and the number keeps on rising. Overcrowding is plaguing the system, and prisoners are forced to live in rough conditions. When examining the state of our prison system, the first area to investigate is the actual structure of the system itself. We interviewed John Lonergan, a man who ran Mountjoy Prison for over 20 years, to explain to us what problems exist within Ireland's prisons.
Now they have refurbished, or they are refurbishing Mountjoy, but they're refurbishing it exactly the way it is at the moment. And while some people say it is, I have people say it's the state of the art. Mountjoy will never be a state of the art in the old building, because the old building doesn't facilitate that. And I suppose one of my criticisms of the prisons was that we built a new prison in the Midlands in Portlaoise, we built a new block in Wheatfield, we built new blocks in Limerick, we're building a new Cork prison, and I would, they're very much the same old stuff as before. Huge emphasis on security and very little emphasis on deinstitution and education and all, reform and all that. So I would say, yeah, we put very little thought. But then, you need a vision and you need to be innovative to see what and to know what is required. And I'm afraid my experience would be that very few people have vision, very few people are innovative, and most people go on the basis, this is what was there before, it worked, let's carry on. The Mountjoy system, Pentonville was introduced in the 1830s, so you're talking about 180 years ago, so it's crazy to be thinking that we're still using the same concepts and the same ideas when every other part of the world has changed so much. 18 hours a day is far too long to be locked up, and if your subject is that for 5 or 6 years, you're definitely going to be institutionalized. And the whole objective of prison should be not to have good prisoners, but to have good future citizens. And that's a very important distinction, because the system is inclined to try to promote good prisoners. Now, good prisoners are not always good citizens, because they'll just behave to be good prisoners, but and they're serving the prison system rather than serving society. The role of staff in prisons, we certainly tried in the women's prison in the Doka Centre for 10 years while I was there, to try to change and enhance the role of prison staff in the whole caring side. Like, for instance, we had sort of got rid of uniforms in relation to the staff, and I wasn't gone an hour when the uniforms were all back and handcuffs were reapplied and all that sort of all negative, destructive stuff. So there's a huge issue about bringing around change and then sustaining it, because a lot of people would have brought about change in many countries around the world, in prisons, individuals and in groups. And the problem with penal or prison progress or prison reform is that it's difficult to achieve it, but it's even 20 times more difficult to sustain it. The Kirsten report, I don't know, you might have read about that, but that was a big report that was looked at women in prison in England. And Baroness Kirsten was her name, and she made tremendous recommendations about women in prison, and most of it for the first 5 years was implemented, and she had even brought it to the government, had a subcommittee looking at it every couple of months, that progress and all that. And then the government changed and they got rid of every single bit of it and went back to basics again. So all the progress she had made, all the different initiatives were all dumped, and back we go again. Conservative government said, bullshit, we go back to where we were. And you see, that's the sort of frustration, that you make progress and then you go back again. And we had single cell room occupancy in the Doka Centre, designed specifically for single room occupancy. We built them so small, designed them so small that they couldn't double up, and still they did double up because they bolted bunks onto the walls.
While it's important to examine how our prisons are ran, we need to see and understand what life is like behind bars in Ireland. While the Irish Prison Service has denied us access into all of Ireland's prisons, we can still show you what life is like for a typical Irish prisoner. Life on the inside is pretty tough. Mountjoy looks its age. It smells. A stale stench lingers out of the open toilets on the landing. The cells are tiny and most hold 2 men. You have somebody breathing on your neck 24/7. You never know what could happen to you. Is it just another normal day? Or will someone slash your face? The spectre of drugs haunts Mountjoy. They're everywhere. Most lads enter clean and leave an addict. The prison is more like a school of crime. A guy comes in here as an inept criminal and leaves with a knowledge and contacts of all those around him. He goes back to crime. There's not much opportunities on the outside. Finally, he ends up back in jail again.
You know, they have state-of-the-art gyms, they have school, and it's not just like to be in a class of 40 like you would be in your normal school. You could be 6 in a class, maybe 3 in a class. They'd also have workshops where they learn trades, anything from woodwork, metalwork to printing. I suppose their cells are not like what you'd see on television. You'd have, in each cell, you have your own toiletry facilities. Some of them even have their own PlayStations and whatever they want in, you know. So, you know, some prisoners they're definitely deserving to be there, you know, kind of. You have some serious criminals in there that would be murderers, you know, with absolutely no care for anybody on the earth, you know, and there's serial rapes in there, you know. I wouldn't have any sympathy for any of them, but, you know, there is lads in there that really should be in, say, a mental hospital, or, you know, that are not deserving to be in prison. Trying to manage the population where you have different criminal factions that are kind of warring on the outside. You have to try and keep them separated. Sex offenders have to be kept separated from other prisoners for their own safety. And vulnerable prisoners have to be looked after in a big way. And it's kind of very hard to manage all that at the same time. And in a way, the prison system tries to look after them as much as possible and does a good job at it. But there's times when people slip through the cracks and problems are kind of missed out upon, you know. So I suppose one evening I was working nights and I found 2 people swinging, hung themselves, both of them on the same landing, only 3 doors apart. And they were found within 12 minutes of each other, and I found them. So I suppose that was the worst experience I had. One of them died, one survived, but it's gone back a long time ago. But I had to say it's something that stuck in my head.
Overcrowding continues to be a problem because we have quite a significant amount of doubling up in Irish prisons today. Doubling up has become a huge issue, and it is a bigger issue than people will imagine, because if you haven't any privacy in prison, if you're doubled up, you never have a moment's privacy. Bullying, sexual abuse, they're all facilitated violence by doubling up, and it makes, I believe, it makes imprisonment twice as difficult as if you had single cells. That's the biggest. The next biggest issue would be occupation. It's very difficult to occupy the prisons. Most prisons are not occupied. They spend a lot of time in cells, about 17 to 18 hours every day in their cells. That's an extraordinary amount of time, and the occupation that they have in many instances is not meaningful. So there is a lot of idleness. Education, I suppose, hasn't been resourced to the level it should be, because education will be at the key for me, at the very hub of the future and how to solve the problem. Drug addiction would be a huge issue. A huge percentage of people going to prison would have drug-related problems. Not all of them are interested in treatment, but those who are, it's often not available to them. That's a huge issue. Psychiatric illness is still a big issue, where, you know, maybe 1 in 4 in Mountjoy had an inpatient history. That's a phenomenal figure. In Mountjoy, 72% of the men in Mountjoy had spent time in St. Patrick's Detention Centre. That's a depressing figure. So you don't get a cross-section of people, we'll say, from Dublin in prison in Mountjoy. You get people from very defined areas. So for that reason, I suppose it's a bit different, and I suppose you could say that is a bit discriminatory as well, because we know that it's not just poor people commit crime, but it certainly seems to be the only people we put to prison, and the vast numbers are poor people. Prison is a disaster for as far as I'm concerned, in terms of a lifestyle. When you'd hear people saying they're better off in prison than on the outside, well, that's a bad reflection on their conditions outside, because if they're worse off, or if they're better off in a place like Mount Jai than they're outside, my God, I wouldn't like to see the conditions there on the outside. So they spend 18 hours a day locked up, 7 days a week. There's a stigma attached to it, so the consequences for your lifestyle afterwards are very significant if you have a prison record. And during the time you're spending, if it's a long sentence of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, that's an eternity to be locked up. So prison is a very, very poor, negative, destructive experience for most people. If I said to you now, I'd recommend you to go to prison for a break, well, I'd say, that would be madness. It's a horrific experience.
Life in prison can be a horrifying experience for anybody to go through. But what is life like for prisoners after they serve their time? Does Ireland offer enough services to help ex-offenders to stay out of trouble and better their futures?
Well, PACE is a voluntary sector organisation, and we've been in existence since 1969. So we're one of the longest serving and largest voluntary sector organisations that work with people coming from prison. So we were specifically set up to provide support in accommodation initially, and then we developed training and education programmes for people who are coming from prison. So that was our core ethos. So you're looking at trying to get people to re-establish themselves in areas that they don't know, and therefore they need a lot of additional support. And for some of the people, particularly the long-term sentence people that we work with, they may have only gotten clean whilst they're in prison, and so they've never been sober or kind of drug-free in the community, so that can be a big risk for them. So the support that we offer there is really, really important. And again, training and education and links into employment is also vital support for people trying to re-establish themselves and move on from an addiction and kind of crime-focused life. No, we're the only agency that looks at everything. We're the only ones that provide specific accommodation for prisoners and ex-prisoners, and we're the only ones that also include training and education. So we do take referrals on a national basis, but we're not enough. We're not enough. There's an increase in homelessness amongst people leaving prison currently, and there's an increase in homelessness in the general population as well. So we're competing for services. We're competing for move-on accommodation as well for people with anybody within the private rented sector. So there aren't sufficient services, and what we know is that transition between prison and the community is a very difficult and challenging time for people. So the more support that's there, the better, and it prevents further offences and it helps to keep society safer. So it makes sense to have services such as ourselves kind of on a national basis in order to support people. Not everybody coming from prison needs it, but for those who do, it's important they can avail of it. Because it's hard. I mean, what we ask people to do is very difficult. We're asking them to give up friends, maybe give up family, to not use drugs, not to drink, and to begin their life all over again. Because sometimes they're the changes that are required for people to not kind of go back into crime. And it's a lot to ask of people, and some people aren't always ready for that. So what we do see is that when people do well, they can do really, really well. Some will always struggle, but that's the whole point, is that they're already citizens of the country. They already have a part to play. We don't always let them, in terms of not being letting prisoners vote and things like that, and we don't always listen to their voice, and I think that's a mistake, because they do have a lot to tell us, and we have a lot to learn from people who've gone through the prison experience. And I think that people, whether they're in prison or not, no matter what they do, they have rights and they have entitlements. They can take rights away from others, and they've also had their own rights taken away from them. But I think we do need to look at them as ordinary people. They're no different than you or I or anybody else, and it's important to remember that. They want a job, they want somewhere to live, they want kind of a family or a relationship, they want to be able to have friends and go out, and they want to be able to travel. So it's the exact same goals that you would have, or I would have, or anybody else would have.
I think the reoffending rate in the prison system is over 40% at the moment of those who are released, and it's the revolving door that you might hear about is very prevalent. In my time, the last 20 years, I've seen the same prisoners coming in and out a lot of the time.
aftercare and support services after prison for young and old prisoners in Ireland is almost non-existent. There's some projects, and today at the moment they're progressing on developing a program called community reintegration, and there's some minimum supports. But I suppose if you were really to say, do we have really adequate alternatives for people leaving prison to move away from criminality and into more structured, normal lifestyles? The reality is we don't.
I'd say the general population of Ireland doesn't even know they exist sometimes, you know.
If you're talking about the general public, they couldn't care less.
Depends on how the issues are presented. So a lot of the media would present images of people in a very poor way when they've committed crime, and the language that they would use to refer to people would be very poor. And the types of names they'd call and the way they refer to the crimes are all about kind of creating fear. Whereas when the public are approached in a way that's kind of sensible and more responsible, we do get a better response. So when we would go in and talk to schools or talk to colleges or do things like that, we always get a very positive response, and people do care. But when they see headlines, when people respond in that way, that deliberately generates fear, and it makes it difficult for people to care, because fear tends to outweigh care at times.
If you ask me, does the broader society have any interest? Not a bit. Their only interest would be in punishment and in very negative sort of a destructive attitude. So in terms of public or political concern for prisoners and what they represent and their conditions and all that, it certainly, in my opinion, it would have no significant status at all in general consensus. And I say, if you ask most of the public, they couldn't care less, and their only attitude would be they deserve what they get. The principle is, the more it fails, the more we increase it. And we seldom ask, well, is punishment working? Does it make a difference? What's the purpose of it? And I'm afraid the public never think about it like that, or never challenge themselves and their social deprivation, poor education, addiction. These are all the things that contribute to criminality. It's not an excuse for it, but it's a contributory factor, and trying to get them to understand that and say, well, right, if you know that these things are the conditions that create and spawn criminality, well then surely you should be taking an interest to try to reduce them.
For the free people of Ireland, life continues moving on. Life moves so fast that we don't stop and think about the most vulnerable members of society. Stop for a second and remember that our men and women behind bars are human beings, not animals. These criminals are parents, siblings, and children. We have to help those without a voice, instead of locking them up and throwing away the key.